Ali, Hafaday, Yakwe, Irananim, to everybody out there, thank you for joining us in this next part of our series, the Future Strategies for Sustainable Micronesia, looking at resilience and opportunity. My name is Dave Sanchez, and I'm here on behalf of IPIKU and the University of Pittsburgh's Global Study Centers to help host this session. We're quite excited, by our speakers, Dr. Michael Gerrard and Benjamin Graham. A little bit about IPIKU. IPIKU stands for the Indigenous Pacific Island Knowledge Universe, and it started organically in 2020, looking to elevate a lot of Micronesian scholarship, concerns, leaders, local and indigenous leaders and scholars around many of the challenges that are converging upon Micronesia. In doing this, we recognize a deep need to build that Pacific partnership, enable existing groups of Micronesian scholars and leaders to catalyze and elevate it, this community-based dialogue around all these phenomena. And so, I'll share with you a few of who they are. Here we have, Minister of State Tina Marug, Dr. Liz Rehabe, from CNMI, Frank Rubaliman from CNMI as well, Cecilia Salvatore from Dominican University, Zita Pangilinan from Guam, and myself. I'm currently situated at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm from Guam. Gardenia Isaac from FSM, and Margarita Cholome from FSM, Senator Hilda Heine, and Marie Madison. These are a number, and the number continue to grow, but representative across Micronesia. It continues to expand, growing from this organic group. But today we're talking about, the title is a little off here. That was our last session, but today we have Dr. Michael Gerrard and Ben Graham here, and so I'm going to turn it over to them to help facilitate this conversation around climate change.
Thank you, David. And let me start off with thanks to David and the other IPIKU members for organizing this talk and this series of very interesting and timely and relevant topics that are being covered. So I have the easy task today of just introducing this session and our speaker, but also go a little bit further, try to set this in the context of the Marshall Islands. So I had the pleasure of working as chief secretary here for 2 years under the last administration with President Hilda Heine, who is a member of IPIKU. And probably one of the topics of the many topics that I had to spend my time and energy on, perhaps more than any other topic, was this issue of climate change as the projections and the assessments by IPCC and others continue to get more dire. For a country like the Marshall Islands, this is something that we have had to really focus a lot more time and attention on. And so if you look at climate change and sea level rise in particular, it really forces us to consider some unprecedented situations and difficult questions. And so questions that we have to face, such as what happens to our sovereignty with sea level rise in particular threatening our territory, and what happens to this idea of statehood. We're still a young developing state, and yet we're now confronting this challenge to our very existence as a state. What happens if we have to be forced to relocate? In a country like the Marshall Islands, we don't have the capacity for internal relocation. So relocation and migration will really have to be external if it comes to that. And then these other questions related to that in terms of our boundaries. What happens if our territory recedes or disappears? What happens to our maritime boundaries, our EEZ, that whole strategic, real estate that we manage as a sovereign state right now? What happens to that? So these are all, as I said, new and difficult questions, and we've been trying to address them for a number of years now. And we're lucky to have people like Professor Gerrard here to help us try to address some of these questions. And Professor Gerrard teaches at Columbia Law School, and he is the founder and faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. He's been working in and with the RMI for more than a decade now, and has helped us on a few different things, and was instrumental in organizing a groundbreaking conference in 2011 entitled Threatened Island Nations: Legal Implications of Rising Seas and Climate Change. That conference was important in that it posed some of these very difficult questions. Those were called new questions back in 2011, and they're still new in the sense that we haven't really reached final resolution and answers on how to address them. But we're happy that Professor Gerrard is here with us today to continue raising these questions and then bringing us up to date on some of the thinking on some of these questions and how to go forward from here. So I'll stop here and hand it over to Professor Gerrard. Thank you.
And thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I appreciate the opportunity. Let me start by saying a few things about what a state is. So a state is an entity under international law. I'm sorry, it has control over its land and its territorial sea, and has some rights to its exclusive economic zone and some rights to the air above it. A state can enter into binding international agreements. It is subject to rights and obligations under international law. It has the ability to make claims before international and national courts in a way that a non-state often cannot. It can be a member of the United Nations and other international bodies. Obviously, it can have citizens and issue passports. It can have courts whose decisions are recognized by the courts of other nations. It can enact laws and enforce them. And it has, all the characteristics of a country, of the basic unit of international law. Now, it has never happened that a state has ceased to exist because of a physical problem. Obviously, states have ceased to exist as a result of military action or political action, but there has never been a situation where a state has ceased to exist because it has gone underwater or been destroyed by a volcano or any other kind of natural factor. So, to most of the questions raised, we don't really know for sure what the answers are, but there are a number of principles of international law that can help inform the answer and help us, predict what would happen if this event really were to occur. So there is no binding legal definition of when a state would cease to exist, but there is a generally accepted definition of how a state can become a state. What are the requirements for becoming a state? These were set forth in a convention that was held in 1933 in Montevideo, and it led to an agreement among the United States and Mexico and 14 states of Central and South America. It has not been ratified by other countries, but it has come to be generally accepted as these are the criteria used in defining what characteristics a state has to have in order to be considered a state. So let me share my screen here. Just 1 second. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to do one more thing here. Okay, I'm going to try that again. Here we go. So under the Montevideo Convention and generally accepted, there are 4 essential elements required to create a state. First is it has to have a defined territory. It has to have land. It's okay if the land is protected by seawalls. If there was land that was formerly above water, is now below water, but it has been filled in so that it's now above water, that's okay. If a platform is built on the land has been submerged, but there's a platform on top of it, that would probably count as territory. But a floating island would not count as territory, or a platform built on the seabed would not count. But so there needs to be some land or something built on top of land that was formerly above the water. So that's the first thing that is necessary. And there's no minimum requirement in terms of the area that's necessary. The second requirement is that it has to have a permanent population. And these, it's not enough for it to be just, lighthouse keepers. The idea is you have a permanent population with families that have the expectation of that's where they will live most of their lives. The expectation is it will have government offices and schools and medical facilities and religious buildings and the sorts of things that you would expect to find in any area that has a permanent population. There's no strict number for how many people are necessary, but there is the case of the Pitcairn Islands, which were, of course, the sort of the descendants of the mutineers of the HMS Bounty and the Tahitian people who accompanied them in 1790 and settled in Pitcairn Island. And there are about around 50 people who live there permanently. The UN has several times stated that Pitcairn Island could probably become a state if it wanted to. It doesn't want to become a state. It's a British overseas territory, and there are certain benefits that it has from that status. But it seems that that 50 people is enough of a permanent population to meet the population criterion of in order to be a state. One exception, one entity that is sort of like a state that doesn't have a permanent population in the same way is Vatican City. So Vatican City doesn't have families for obvious reasons, but it has people who live there for extended periods of time. And it's not completely a state, but it has some status under the United Nations. But generally, there has to be a permanent population of families living on the territory. And that means the territory has to be large enough to accommodate families living there. Now, theoretically, I suppose they could live in a single high-rise building with a platform. But they have to be able to live there. The third requirement is that there be a government, and one would ordinarily expect that it's a government that would have an executive and a parliament and a court system, the three normal elements of a government. They don't have to be of any particular size. The executive branch doesn't have to have any particular number of employees, but it needs to be able to function. It needs to be able to carry out what are seen as the usual functions of a government. And those include things like collecting taxes, passing laws, enforcing those laws, and very importantly, being able to maintain relations with other countries. The offices of the country don't necessarily need to be located on the territory. We can talk about that a little bit later, but it does have to have a functioning government, and that would presumably include offices and a place for all these people to work. Then the fourth essential element is independence and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. And as a practical matter, what that mostly means is that other states recognize it. Other states recognize its existence as a state, and they can exchange ambassadors. I think it's especially important. It's not necessarily a legal requirement, but I think it's especially important that there be an ambassador to the United Nations in order to maintain relations with the UN. Having a permanent office in New York at the UN, near the UN, would be very helpful. But it's really a matter of other states recognizing it recognizing other states, and being a member of the international community. Let me go to my other slide. So, who determines whether an island state has ceased to exist? Of course, that's never happened. There's never been such a determination, but there have been some instances where the United Nations has kicked out a country, and the most prominent example of that, of course, was 1971, when the United Nations General Assembly voted to kick out the government in Taiwan and recognize the government in Beijing as the legitimate representatives of China. And so that took a vote of the United Nations General Assembly. There was some dispute about whether a simple majority vote would be necessary, or whether a 2/3 vote of the members would be necessary, because under the United Nations Charter, a 2/3 vote is necessary in order to address major questions. But the loss of statehood, if, for instance, one or more of the 4 criteria that I just talked about were lost, the loss of statehood would not be automatic. It wouldn't be a situation where, the last person leaves the island and it's automatically no longer a state. It would take an affirmative act, probably by the United Nations General Assembly, to declare that what had been a state is no longer a state. Now, some of the characteristics of statehood could sort of creep away. I mean, if other countries were saying, well, we don't think you're still a state, that could, have a snowball effect. But there is a general presumption in international law that a state is permanent, that once a state, always a state, unless there is, some military action or political action that clearly means it's no longer a state. The right to self-determination is firmly established in international law. The right to survival of a state is well understood in international law. And also the notion that a state has permanent sovereignty over its natural resources. So the presumption is that a state will remain a state, and it wouldn't automatically stop being a state if it lost any of those 4 characteristics. If it did lose some of those characteristics, the parties that are most likely to try to put into motion the steps to affirmatively take away statehood I think would be those countries that fish in the exclusive economic zone and want to be able to stop paying for the fishing rights. So that seems to me is the most likely scenario when someone would start a proceeding before the United Nations General Assembly to try to take a state off the list of states and try to take away its exclusive economic zone. Now, what if a state or all the people in a state wanted to move to another country's territory? We have had in history the example of a government in exile. That certainly happened during the First World War and the Second World War. But in those instances, the expectation was that it was temporary, that at the end of the war, the government would move back to its own territory. We don't have examples of permanent governments in exile. It is possible to imagine that happening, that if some other country were to say that the government of the Marshall Islands and many of the people of the Marshall Islands can relocate to their territory, that you could have the continuation of the state if you still had these four other characteristics that I was just talking about. But I think you would still need to have those four other characteristics. I could also imagine a situation where some other state cedes some of its territory, gives up some of its territory to a country like the Marshall Islands. If some other country were to give one of its own islands to the Marshall Islands, and everybody from the Marshall Islands or a lot of people from the Marshall Islands go to that other island, and the government relocates there, you might recreate these four characteristics. You might have a new permanent territory and permanent population and a government. It would then require other countries to recognize it. It would, the safest thing probably would be to get a United Nations General Assembly resolution recognizing this new, that the country has moved to this different island, but it's still a state. That leaves open the question of what happens to its exclusive economic zone and so forth. And this is sort of one of the things that is completely unsettled. The status of the maritime zones around a place that has gone underwater is really an open question. The legal part of the legal question is framed as, are the baselines ambulatory? Do they move? If the shoreline moves, usually the exclusive economic zone is measured from the shoreline. But if the shoreline moves in or out, do the borders of the exclusive economic zone move in and out with it? And what if an island or other feature is completely underwater? Does it still have exclusive economic zone? So that is not those are not questions for which there is a very clear answer. If an island is no longer habitable at all, but is still above water, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, it's considered a rock rather than an island. And a rock has a territorial sea, which is usually 12 miles, but does not have an exclusive economic zone, which is usually 200 miles. But these are still open questions to which there's no established answer. We can talk about whether there are ways to try to firm up the answers to this. And that ideally might happen through a resolution by the UN General Assembly. Some of these issues about what happens to the maritime boundaries could be cleared up by an amendment to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. There are some theories under which some of these issues might be resolved by a decision of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But all of these things are really uncertain. But I hope I've given you some of the general guidelines. And let me close the slides. And let me just say one other thing. There are some academic theories floating around about a deterritorialized country, a state that has no physical territory. That would be a new animal under international law. It doesn't exist. There are some theories that it should, that you could have a government permanently in exile, or a state that has no, that is not attached to any territory of its own. But that has never happened, and we're not sure if it ever could happen. But there's a theory out there. So why don't I now turn it back to Ben and invite Ben to pose any questions that he has.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We do have one question from Senator Hilda. She asks, would land or a platform built on reef flats qualify as defined territory? So reef flats are areas that are currently not inhabited. They're just reef flats, as you know, you've been here. If new land is built or some type of platform is built on a reef flat, would that be accepted as territory?
Yeah, and this is a reef flat that is contiguous to the island, or what had been an island?
Yes.
Yes, I would expect that the answer to that would be yes. I would think that that has enough of the characteristics of the sort of land that would be necessary that it would count.
Okay. All right, to our participants, the floor is open now for any comments or questions that you may have. You can raise your hand or write your questions in the chat box. I will say one thing, Professor. There is a regional effort in terms of the maritime boundaries through the Pacific Island Forum and some other organizations to try to fix the boundaries. I guess that's the word that they use, so that they become permanent, even against receding baselines. I was thinking about this question the other day. Obviously, countries like the Marshalls and island states are concerned about this and want to fix their maritime boundaries. But isn't this a challenge for any coastal state? I mean, if the coastline of the United States is receding because of sea level rise, wouldn't it be also concerned about this question of trying to fix its maritime boundaries? Even if it's not an island state, if it's a coastal continental state.
Yeah, of course, there wouldn't be an existential threat to the to a country like that, but that issue could come up. I'm not aware of there being a place where there's been such a serious fallback of the coastline to really make that a serious issue. With respect to the effort in the Pacific, I'm aware of that, and I think that's a very good effort. It is not necessarily binding on more distant countries that they want to fish there. I think it's a very helpful thing to have and to have done, but a more distant country that wanted to fish in those waters could have an argument that they're not bound by this agreement that countries elsewhere have entered into.
Okay. We have a question here from Elizabeth Rechabe, who says, under the Montevideo Convention, as well as other conventions, to what extent do states that are under threat from climate change have the right resources or opportunities to amend those to protect their interests, especially if they are not the main contributors to climate change?
Well, the Montevideo Convention is not a living convention, like in the sense that it meets frequently, like the UN climate change conference. So it's not so there isn't a body or a group that one can go to for an amendment to that prior agreement. There are very strong moral and ethical arguments that the fact that these small island nations contributed almost nothing to the climate change problem and yet are the biggest victims of it, that should entitle them to all kinds of consideration by the international community. I think there'd be a very strong case to be made. And if this situation were to arise, one could easily envision making a strong case to the United Nations General Assembly or the UN Conference on Law of the Sea or the Climate Change Convention that the international community ought to recognize what would be a just outcome. But there isn't an established forum to modify the Montevideo criteria.
Does that address your question, Elizabeth? Not sure if she's able to come on. Any other questions or comments?
I think I see David Sanchez's hand up.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and hop on here. Thank you very much, Dr. Gerrard, for the presentation. Very insightful and informative. And I know we have some other questions in the Q&A. But I wanted to ask about the requirement for the permanent population and if there's any thoughts or theories about what the inhabitation means. And so you can imagine that with, various different islands in close proximity, one might be able to, frequent, certain areas, a lot more, but may not be residing there as you would in terms of, sleeping in permanent structures there. Is there any sense of, the consistent, the frequency of which you attend to a place in which you've actually used that place or the resources and historically have done so? Is there any convention to recognize that in terms of those resources have sustained this population, and this population, while concentrated in a small area or in a neighboring island, would still have rights to those atolls that have gone underwater? Or is it just hard and fast, you must be residing, permanently and fully on a specific piece of land?
So nothing is hard and fast here, since this has never actually happened. But I would think that just visiting and never sleeping there wouldn't count. I think people would be expected to have a permanent residence there and to frequently stay there, for some period of time. I think just hopping in and out would not be enough. How many nights you'd need to be there, I don't know. I mean, this kind of question arises where I am in New York City. How many nights do you have to stay here before you have to pay local taxes? So that kind of thing arises, and there are strict rules for that. But in this situation, that situation was not envisioned by in 1933 when they were meeting in Montevideo. But I do think that the idea would be that this would be the primary residence of these folks. They don't have to be there 365 days a year, but much of the time they have to be there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we just related to that, David. We just had a census here in the Marshall Islands last year, and it's being finalized now. And I used to work at the U.S. Census Bureau in D.C. for a couple of years, so there are sort of legal definitions of residency. You have to reside in the country for a certain number of, in order for you to be counted in the census. Otherwise, you're a visitor or you're non-resident, so you're not counted. But yeah, I think that is a good question, because we do have atolls here in the Marshalls that we claim as part of our own, but there's no permanent population. And in fact, one of them way up north has a U.S. flag on it, even though it's been part of our traditional domain for forever. But because there was no permanent population there, it's been taken more or less, which is still an issue. We have a question from Marie Madison here in Madras. She says, regarding the presence of a functional government, what happens when one or two of the branches of government are outside the physical boundaries of the state?
I think that's probably okay as long as it's functioning as and recognized as the government. So if the president is living someplace else, but is still recognized as the president, or if the court system is sitting someplace else, but is still recognized as the court system, and the people who live in the country recognize the judgments of the court as valid, and that sort of arrangement. I don't think that every branch of government has to be physically located in the territory.
Okay. Marie, I hope that answers your question. We have a question from anonymous attendee. I'm sure you're familiar with Vanuatu's climate change case being launched in the ICJ for a summary judgment on whether claims can be made on loss and damage, etc. What do you think of that case?
Well, in the first place, they're not yet in front of the ICJ. They're trying to be in front of the ICJ, but in order to actually be in front of the ICJ, they would require a majority vote of the UN General Assembly. Of course, back in 2012 or 2013, as many of you know, the Marshall Islands and Palau tried to bring a question before the ICJ, but the United States opposed it, and they were never able to get a majority vote in the United Nations General Assembly. And here too, Vanuatu is campaigning, but has not yet gotten a vote, and it's not clear whether the votes are there. It's also not completely clear exactly what question would be posed to the ICJ. I don't think that they would be asking the ICJ to award loss and damage to Vanuatu or to the other countries. I think that would be further than it would be advisable to try to go. I think it may be more likely that they would want a declaration, perhaps of the obligations of the developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to slow down climate change. The question of exactly how to phrase the question put to the ICJ is a subject of much discussion and hasn't been resolved. But I don't think that it would involve awarding loss and damage. For one thing, the ICJ only has jurisdiction over countries that have agreed to be subject to the jurisdiction of the ICJ for the sort of question that that is posed. And so, the historically largest emitting country, the United States, has not accepted the jurisdiction of the ICJ for general matters. They do accept the jurisdiction of the ICJ for things like boundary disputes, but for many other things they don't. And certainly if the ICJ were to somehow say that the major emitting countries were responsible for loss and damage, I'm confident the US would reject that for, among other reasons, saying that they have not agreed to the jurisdiction of the ICJ. They have not waived their sovereign immunity to allow such a judgment to be imposed on them.
Okay. I think that question was pretty thoroughly answered. Anonymous attendee, if you have any follow-ups, you can follow up in the quick Q&A. We have a second question, a follow-up question from Marie. Does that mean that all three branches can exist off island? In the event of total outmigration, a functional government would still exist?
Perhaps. I mean, if you still had territory and you still had a permanent population on the territory, I could imagine a situation where the government is functioning in some other place, and that's recognized. But again, it has never arisen, so we don't know for sure. There would have to be some mechanism for this government to exert control over the territory. I don't know whether that means, at a minimum, a police officer. I don't know exactly what that would amount to, but the government, wherever it's located, would need some mechanism for exerting control over the or exercising some authority, at least some law enforcement and tax collection and other authority over the people who are living in the territory.
Okay. Maria, I hope that addresses your question. You see your hand is still up, but maybe that was for the previous one. Any other questions or comments from participants? One thing I wanted to, just from my side, I see Mahendra. Mahendra, why don't you go ahead, and then I'll get to my question after you. Are you able to come on, Mahendra?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Michael, for a very lucid presentation. Just following up from the ICJ issue, we were actually on a seminar yesterday, and in fact, there are a number of student groups from the Pacific who are now trying to go through the route of the forum and so on, apparently CARICOM as well. It seems like a lot of the island states are probably quite in favor of getting some sort of opinion from the ICJ. And as you said, it's not necessarily just for loss and damage, but it's really in terms of culpability for the greenhouse gas emissions and so on. Now, given that the US is obviously not a member, I mean, would it really have the ultimate sort of authority to sort of not recognize any judgment, or in fact, more sort of specifically, would ICJ have the power and the jurisdiction to provide an opinion on such matters? Thank you.
So I have to distinguish between two kinds of things that the ICJ can do. It can issue a binding ruling in a contentious case, or it can issue an advisory opinion. A binding ruling in a contentious case it can only be issued against parties to the ICJ, parties that have accepted the jurisdiction of the ICJ. An advisory opinion is not limited in that way. And so the ICJ could issue an advisory opinion saying that, in its opinion, the major emitting countries of the world, including the US, have an obligation to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. That would not give them enforcement power. However, it would be a very powerful statement of international law that other tribunals would listen to and could take seriously. So it would have an impact. It would not allow the ICJ to send officials to U.S. banks and seize money, but it would be the sort of declaration that would be taken very seriously, that some of the courts in other countries might take seriously. So it might have some influence on the course of future UN climate negotiations. So it could have a real impact.
Mahendra, do you have any follow-on to that?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for the response.
Marie, I see your hand is still up. Are you? Do you have any follow-up questions on your earlier points? Are you still there, Marie? Okay, maybe we'll come back to Marie. I see her hand is down now. So Professor Gerrard, I was going to say, more and more people here in the Marshalls have been talking about this idea of reclaiming or building new land that is elevated and will protect some resident population into sometime into the future. And many people have looked at the Maldives and what they've done over there in the Indian Ocean. They've actually built a new island on a reef flat and have already relocated some 45, 50,000 people from many of their outer islands and sort of consolidated them there. There are issues, so it's sort of a live experiment. Many of the people there are not able to find meaningful livelihoods and employment. They're just sort of in this urban setting now. So they're protected, but they don't have really a means of living. But it seems likely that if we're going to have to elevate some parts of the country, given the costliness of that exercise, it's going to be limited to maybe one or two or just a few areas like the urban centers, Majuro or Kwajalein, and that there's going to have to be some sort of consolidation. And so you will have the territorial sort of, the territory will be shrunk into sort of one or two central consolidated populations. And so that then leads to other questions. Again, going back to, are you still able to then maintain your boundaries, your sovereign boundaries, if your dry land, your territory has receded to just a couple of dots on the map versus a lot of dots spread out over a large area? So this is more of just a comment just to say this is where some of the discussion is going now, but any thoughts on that?
So in the first place, in order to maintain the EEZ, as opposed to just the 12-mile territorial territorial zone, an area needs to be habitable, but it doesn't necessarily need to be actually inhabited. So if you still have land that is, above water at high tide, and it's not just a barren rock, there would be an argument that it's still habitable, because the requirement for permanent territory that's inhabited, it concerns statehood, doesn't concern the maritime boundaries. This is I wrote an article actually a few years ago saying that as a matter of climate justice, there should be an international agreement that an island nation's maritime zones should be fixed and should not shrink, even if some of the islands themselves shrink or go under, just as very slight recompense for what has happened to these countries through no fault of their own. And one could imagine an international agreement to that effect, going to the UN and saying that you should, or the UN Conference on Law of the Sea, that you should pass a resolution saying this. I'm not saying as a strategic matter that ought to be done now, but I could imagine it. Without that, there will just be a lot of uncertainty that some other countries' fishing boats will go within 200 miles of this uninhabited semi-submerged island and say, we don't need to pay you anything. And there'll then be a dispute about that. And there might be some advantages to trying to get that resolved before it actually happens.
And that's where I think bringing back this idea of regional cooperation and regionalism really is to our advantage if we're able to get a number of the island states to work together on this versus just a few of them. So we have a comment from.
Let me just say that I agree that if you had a bunch of these island states, it's not just the Marshalls going together, and ideally not just in the Pacific, if you have some of the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean and so forth, joining together to the UN and saying, we want you to adopt this new rule that could have much greater force.
Appreciate if you could share with us that article that you just referenced. That I think would be worth sharing with others and thinking about this going forward.
Sure.
We have a comment from Johnny Hadley. He says, the issue of economic borders in the Micronesian countries has always been about its economic resources, particularly tuna. This topic about climate change degradation as an issue of a country's political boundary or territory is very interesting, and in my view should be looked into further, since the reality is impacting all of us in the FAS countries. So I think similar sentiment to what we've just been talking about.
Yes, no, I agree with that.
All right, I don't see any more hands. I don't see.
There are two
Here.
questions in the Q&A.
Sorry, two questions. Okay, all right. Sorry, I missed that. Okay, Hilda, the potential loss of maritime boundary is huge for SIDS. In addition to going to the UN to preserve its boundaries, what other legal remedies might be possible? Would the country lose its airspace when land area is submerged as well? Very good question. You want to address that, Professor Gerrard?
Yeah, I think that if a country loses its, certainly if it loses its territory, if it loses its EEZ, I think it probably also loses its airspace above that area. I can't tell you I've researched that. I will, but look into it. I haven't looked into it, but it seems to me most likely that it would lose its airspace at the same time.
Yeah. To my understanding, airspace is sort of determined by your surface space, I guess, if you put it that way. And so there's probably going to be some impacts on that, which probably requires yet another initiative through some other convention or agreement that determines airspace. So lots to think about. Larry Rigatal says, what happens when the islands are no longer states because they have sunk? Do the areas become international waters or owned by the nearest states with mountains? It's a different way of asking one of the questions we've been trying to address.
Well, if the sunken island is within the exclusive economic zone of another country, then I think that other country would have a claim that it now would control that area of water. If it is not within 200 miles of any other country, then it is international waters.
Okay. Yeah, I think just to reiterate the question, in addition to going to the UN to preserve its boundaries, what other legal remedies might be possible? Yes, I think that was part of Hilda's question. Professor, I don't know if you had a chance to hear that part.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there are additional legal remedies that I can think of. I could, again, trying to seek a declaration from some international body, and conceivably, the General Assembly or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or or maybe the UN Climate Convention. One could imagine going to one of those bodies and trying to get some kind of a declaration. Let me just say, I just put in the chat, I found the little article I had written about maritime boundaries, and I just put it in the chat, so you have that.
All right, thank you. Okay, I don't see anyone else have any questions or comments. I think we've addressed all of them to this point. Obviously, these are best attempt answers to some very difficult questions, and just as we've been pondering these over the last decade or more, we'll probably still be raising and trying to address these over the next decade or more. And so I think this brings us to a good point of closure as best we can in terms of addressing some of these complex and difficult questions. So I'm going to hand it back to you, David, to wrap up the session. And I want to thank Professor Gerrard and all the participants in this session. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. On behalf of IPIKU and the Global Studies Center over at the University of Pittsburgh, thank you everybody for joining us. As I shared earlier, this recording will be made public and available for all those who signed up, and also on IPIKU's site. Thank you very much, Professor Gerrard, and thank you, Ben, for being here and sharing with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.